All right. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the second ASQ Blog Virtual Reception. For those of you who are not familiar with who we are ASQ Blog, which is a student-run organization supported by the ASQ Editorial Board. We have been providing behind-the-scenes look at the articles that's being published on ASQ on our ASQ Blog website, as well as podcast and Spotify's podcast on Spotify and iTunes. I'm one of the organizers, Yusaku Takeda from Harvard University, together with the four other organizers who are here today. We have Kevin Lee from NYU, Melody Chan from Yale, Ainwi Muma from Stanford, and Hui San from Northwestern. This is our second virtual reception. Last time we welcomed the incumbent and incoming editors of ASQ, Professors Henrik Grieve and Christine Beckman, to talk about the past and future of the ASQ journal. Today, we are fortunate to have two rising scholars in our field, Professor Hila Lifshitz-Assaf and Derek Harmon, who two of the ASQ Best Dissertation-Based Paper Award winners, as well as Professor Mark David Seidel. Professor Lifshitz-Assaf is a 2019 inaugural winner of the ASQ Best Dissertation-Based Paper Award. She's a graduate of Harvard Business School and currently is Associate Professor of Information Operations and Management Science at NYU Stern School of Business. Her research focuses on the new ways of organizing innovation in the digital age. Her work has appeared in the numerous leading journals such as ASQ, Academy of Management Journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and so on. Professor Derek Harmon is the 2020 winner of the ASQ Best Dissertation-Based Paper Award. He received his PhD at the University of Southern California in 2016. And he's currently assistant professor of strategy at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. He studies how organizations manage relationships with various market actors, and he has published in the leading journals as well, such as ASQ, Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Review, among many others. We are also fortunate to have Professor Mark David Seidel, who is an RBC Financial Group Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of British Columbia. And he's also has been Associate Editor of ASQ for many years. He's a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley Haas School of Business. And his research spans wide-ranging topics such as social networks, discrimination in employment relationships, innovations, and so on. He has published numerous articles from leading journals of our field, such as ASQ, SMJ, AMJ, American Journal of Sociology, among many others. Our reception today is divided into three parts. First, each award winner would present a brief overview of their award-winning papers, followed by a discussion session moderated by Mark David. So for this session, I would ask you to not to speak up the questions, but feel free to drop any questions or comments on the chat. And at the end of the very session, we're going to open up to the audience, and we're going to create a breakout rooms for each of the guests today, and so that the participants can move across different breakout rooms freely. So without further ado, please welcome our distinguished guest today. And Hila is going to present her research first.
Thank you so much for hosting us and for this special event. I'm very excited both to, present this study that I've dedicated so many years of my life to, but especially for the breakout rooms and actually to get to know students. It's really wonderful to have kind of 100 students and to get to hear all your research topics and your questions. So I'm looking forward to the breakout room. So I'll tell you just for 10 minutes about my study, and then I will love to have your questions, and feel free to write it in the chat and I'll try to respond also later. So my study was on dismantling knowledge boundaries at NASA, the critical role of professional identity in open innovation. And my research motivation overall is around how technology changes impact the process of scientific and technological innovation. If I look at it historically, I'm curious about the fact that we've changed so much in our technologies today, but the way that we organize not necessarily has changed as dramatically, but maybe it is. And that's kind of the questions that I'm looking at, like where is it changing, where isn't it? And the questions that I've been studying is where it is changing, how is it changing professionals' work and themselves? How is it changing the innovation process? And what are those new emergent roles, structure that we see in new ways of innovating? So today I will share with you my NASA study. I have some new studies also on how, for instance, hackathons are creating an accelerated process of innovation, and how, especially now with COVID time, a lot of companies and organizations are trying to work on the process speed and to accelerate. How open innovation and GitHub and open source impact people that work. And that's the type of things that I'm studying. And, you know, future research is also, of course, that is kind of now is around AI and its impact. So I would say this is broadly my research interest, and I will start with the impact on professionals and their work. And this is something that I focused in this paper because everything that we know from the literature tells us that if professionals will start opening their boundaries to innovation online, and this is what I'm talking about today, the instance of this new way of organizing is open online innovation. Imagine you posting your research questions on a platform out there and everyone else is solving it. So everything that we know on professionals will tell us that they will reject it because they are used to having clearly predefined and selectively permeable boundaries. They choose who to collaborate with, who to work, which knowledge to keep inside and which knowledge to share outside. On the other hand, we know that knowledge boundaries are changing. The web, digitization has changed boundaries, and there's been a call in the literature to re-examine the literature. So despite that kind of, I would say, fact from the literature that most of the reactions of professionals are boundary protecting, I was curious to see how does it fit with what we're reading that is happening in the field. And this is what I went and basically did for 3 years. I conducted a field study at NASA that did a big experiment with open online innovation platforms and community. I studied them before, throughout, and after. This is me near a lunar rover, and this is a picture of things that I saw, like the cafeteria. These are the type of lunch conversations people have them with them, and like funny things. I was the weird one. I was not the scientists or engineers. All of them were scientists and engineers. I had to explain what's a PhD in management, like what does it even mean? We can talk about it later. But basically that was the research design. And I would say the strength of it was that I got to see them before, throughout, and after. And this is why I spent a lot of time collecting the data before as well. So I did a lot of observation. I joined weekly meetings in the labs. You will see that my study, the experiment spans across 14 different labs. And I spent time on their weekly meetings. I interviewed more than 100 interviews, structured, semi-structured, most of them I would say semi-structured, but repeating interviews, which is something that I warmly recommend because people open up over time. And then the last thing is using internal documents and surveys. That's very important. You will see that what I study is knowledge work and knowledge boundary work. So it's one thing what people say in meetings that I could see, it's another thing what they say to you in person, but it's very different what actually happens in the project work. And that's I got to see thanks to the fact that I was able to get access to their internal documents. So this is about the data sources, and I'll tell you a little bit about what was this experiment. So the Open Innovation Experiment, this is was basically done by NASA Space Life Science Division. That's the LSSD, NASA acronyms. And this is the organizational structure in yellow in the bottom. And each of these labs that I told you about had this kind of project for that year. And for 1 year, very courageously, NASA decided to work on their projects as they were supposed to internally with collaborations, contractors, but also to post it online on these new open innovation platforms and communities that everybody has been talking about. And these are very big and known ones for those of you who may not know: Innocentive, Yet to Come, and Taupe Coder. They've been around there for more than a decade. They didn't have to choose any specific ones. They just went and did a benchmark study. What are the most leading online open innovation platforms? These were the ones, we're just going to post them there. And I'm saying it's courageous because most of the organizations that are using open innovation usually start with maybe one project. But here they basically took all their strategic plan for that year and basically uploaded it for the world to solve. And for 1 year, the experiment was planned to take place, but in 3 months already over 3,000 solvers from 80 countries tried to solve NASA's 14 problems. And you can imagine they have more than like 100, 200 people internally, of course, best experts in their fields. But here you get this interesting cognitive diversity from the crowd. And the interesting part that the results were successful beyond expectation. So out of these 14 problems that in those 3 months, none of them were solved internally or with collaborations, 3 were solved by the crowd and by experts, external ones in the crowd, and others were partially solved, as you can see. And especially one became known as the home run solution, predicting solar flares. So solar flares, I don't want to get you scared because it's like a scary thing that can impact Earth, but this year, we don't need to worry about it. We have enough on our heads, COVID and everything. This year is a solar minimum. This is actually the peak of how low it gets. So you can see, for instance, this year versus 2 years ago, how close we were to solar flares. So solar flares are radiation, very dangerous ones, and we basically don't have a prediction models in 24 hours. We only know months ahead, and we need to know if we can be safe for space and also for Earth. And the guy who solved it is this person who allowed me to share his photo. He got it in an award for this amazing scientific breakthrough that he basically solved a problem of all the heliophysics domain for more than a decade, a problem that cost around $800 million a year for NASA, Boulder, Colorado, NOAA, other organizations. That's the budget estimated, and he solved it for an award of $30,000. He's a semi-retired radio engineer in New Haven that was basically sharing this picture and say, please do more of this, otherwise this is what I'm doing every night. From a scientific perspective, the scientists tried his solution and saw that it was even better than what he estimated. So they were completely surprised. They said, this is spun off so fast here, it's caught everyone off guard. A solution like this could take years. So it's faster, it's cheaper. What should we do the next day? So everyone got super excited by this scientific breakthrough that became fast and cheap through these online open innovation platforms. It got all the way to the White House Office of Science and Technology, policy, awards, etc. But internally, when the management tried to bring everyone and said, okay, let's move from experimentation to integration, let's make it part of our R&D process, all of a sudden, a lot of fire and fragmentations and tensions started taking place. And the paper focused around this really fascinating tension that happened even within labs. Some people would say, this is a slap in the face when I see opportunities to use this yet to come incentive. It's extremely frustrating. Like, what value am I? I came here to innovate. I sacrificed my life to innovate. So now you're giving all my solutions, all my problems to be solved outside. This is an anathema to the way that we're trained and modeled. This is like cheating. Every time that I have a problem, I'm putting it outside. So what's the value of my work? On the other hand, people were saying, wait a minute, this is about science. It's about the big agenda. Forget about the personal one. Science is about finding the truth. We can actually protect radiation now. Maybe we can get to Mars through that. And this became this interesting tension in which I conceptualized as identity work because it was very personal. I have to say this was a surprising part for me as well, that I would ask people, what do you think about open innovation and crowdsourcing platforms? And they would talk immediately about themselves. And on one hand, there were people that were doing this identity protection work. They protected who they are. They didn't want to hear about open innovation. On the other hand, there were people that going through this reflection and refocusing and reconstructing their identity. And these people talked about the need to move from problem solvers to solution seekers, to change the way they think, because the solution can come from their lab, from someone online, from a collaborator. It doesn't matter anymore. They should stop thinking about themselves as problem solvers and start thinking about themselves as solution seekers. This was a deep transformation that basically I follow in the full paper from the professional identity and how it impacts their work. Remember, I talked about the documents, then I went and saw, was there a change? And you can see that some of them talked about a really big change. And I talked about this full knowledge boundary dismantling. They talked about changing from seeing the lab as their world, of all of a sudden the whole world is their lab. And they literally left the lab. And in the full paper, I present the different types of full dismantling. So there were people on the extreme fully dismantling and people that completely protected, but there were people in the middle that said that they were doing, but did not really change anything in their work process. Those are the people that fully dismantled. Just to give you a sense of how it looked, they left the lab, they do all their R&D outside. So what I conceptualize is the way that external knowledge came in and what happened with it, whether those solutions were integrated, what happened to the internal knowledge, is it open and shared or not, and where is the locus of innovation in the end of the day? Is innovation happening internally among few collaborators or now completely distributed? And in that case of the full dismantling, it's completely out there. But it required a deep transformation of how they think about themselves. So a year later, people talk about is this deep philosophical change. They had to change something that this is how they've been trained since they were kids to solve problems, to be the experts of a field and solve. So it wasn't something easy. But the good news, I would say, that it's still going on. A year later, for instance, you can see that it doesn't even require the mindset, makes such a big difference. It doesn't even require an open innovation platform necessarily. There was a problem with some of the astronauts' visual devices, and they needed to see what's going on. And one of the engineers, as they were thinking about making a big contract, basically on her weekend, she found a device on YouTube. She emailed that physician that developed it, and 3 months later, you can see it in the International Space Station. So things can change, but they are costly. So what do we take from it? I would say theoretically, there's a lot to take here about the future of work that we're seeing, and now I'm seeing similar things with AI, that there is this unexplored relationship between the work, in this case it's knowledge work, and our own personal and professional identity. And we need to understand this connection, I think, better between the doing and being that happens when we're changing. And the important role that professional identity work can have. We can change the way we think about ourselves, and it will change the way we work. And knowledge boundary dismantling work, those that really changed what they did, it's also important to remember, because a lot of the literature has been talking about we can cross boundaries, we can bring, but you can actually change the boundaries of your work. And in the end of the day, about open innovation and these new ways of processing, I would say that this study shows the significant opportunity, fast, better, amazing, but also a challenge. It's not so fast to do it organizationally. It took 3 years. They're still working on it, and it's a big challenge. So that's it on my end, and I would love to hear questions.
So should I go, or what are we?
Yes.
Yeah, let's move on to Derek.
Okay. So wow, first of all, what an awesome paper. I reread your paper over the weekend, Hila, and man, what a cool freaking paper. Okay, so my presentation will have absolutely no citations. So there you go. If you want to look at citations, look at the paper. Okay. This is a paper about the Federal Reserve, but let's step back and kind of understand the intuition of this paper. So coming from more of like an institutional perspective, we know a lot of things about how institutions work. We know that much of our kind of everyday way of thinking and behaving is silently guided by these like taken for granted assumptions that are collectively held. And that's the power of institutions. This is like what's beautiful about institutions. It makes institutions resilient, self-activating, stable, reproducing over time. But of course, we also know that some of these assumptions can be disrupted with major intentional events. So for example, you've got external jolts. You've got the financial crisis that kind of jolted us to understand that we took for granted the stability of our financial system, and we found out we might have been wrong. We are living through a major jolt right now where we're finding out that our assumptions about the medical system and a variety of other considerations about our daily lives were not what we thought. And actually, I think another cool example is, when somebody outside of the professions comes up with a very novel way to spot sunspots, and it kind of jolts the internal professions of NASA researchers. But of course, we know that external jolts don't just disrupt our assumptions. When you intentionally try to change those assumptions, they can be disrupted as well. This goes back to some of the work by Harold Garfinkel, where he, asked his students in the 60s to do super weird things to reveal people's background expectancies. So he asked students to like sit down in an elevator instead of stand up, or treat their parents when they went home as like people that run hotels instead of their parents. And it just like reveals what we assumed all along. And then of course, in the institutional literature, there's this bigger conversation about heroic change agents. If we want to change, we disrupt the institution and we deliberately do this. My paper is about the following. If we actually take seriously the very nature of taken for grantedness, then these assumptions should be disrupted whenever we draw attention to them. And most importantly, even when that attention is supportive. Let me give you 2 examples. A couple years ago, Steven Mnuchin, US Treasury Secretary, tweeted right before Christmas, "Today I convened individual calls with the CEOs of the 6 largest banks, and they confirmed they all have ample liquidity to lend to markets and consumers." The Washington Post wrote this article the same day. Mnuchin startled the markets when he tried to reassure Americans that the banks had ample credit. Trump has been furious that efforts by Mnuchin to inspire confidence, which is what this tweet was supposed to do, have failed. And this is a great quote by economist Diane Swank at Grant Thornton, suggesting you might know something that no one else is worried about creates more unease. This is kind of an intuition underlying my paper. This is the best tweet that came out afterwards. Mnuchin's statement is like the defense secretary tweeting out of the blue, "Don't worry, I checked all of the nuclear subs and they are definitely still loyal to the US. You know, I wasn't worried that they weren't until you said something. Now I have some questions," okay? Let's bring this closer to home. About a month ago, COVID-19 vaccine developers signed a pledge to adhere to the high scientific and ethical standards to conduct clinical studies. Now, for those that thought they were cutting corners all along, this might have actually made you feel a little bit better. But for those of us that assumed that even in the face of political pressure that they were maintaining ethical standards, this was a bit jarring. This creates like, well, if you're telling me this, then what were you doing before? And so it raises a bigger question about the fragile nature of taken for grantedness. When something reaches the status of taken for grantedness, the existing research generally assumes that it becomes like this huge, powerful force that silences the world. You know, it takes on an objective, natural, fact-like quality. We no longer see the contingent or social origins, and alternative ways of thinking become impossible, right? And I guess what I'm trying to argue is simply explicitly reaffirming, even when you're trying to reaffirm these taken for granted assumptions, that it will rip off this collectively held veneer. And in doing so, it exposes these contingent and social origins. It exposes possible alternatives that we didn't think about. And it forces individuals, and this is Garfinkel's quote, it forces individuals to manage the reconstruction of the natural facts by themselves without this consensual validation that we now see as non-fact-like. It's now real again. And this is what I study in the context of the Federal Reserve. So I'll just give you a little bit of background and tell you how I've executed it here and why this is a unique and good context to do this. So the Fed is the US central bank established in 1913 to avoid financial panics. Their primary kind of broader aim is to maintain stability and confidence in what they're doing. Like trust in the institution itself is one of the most important things that makes them functional. Before 1994, they didn't say anything to the public. They had this policy where they just decided to never explain and behave predictably. And if they just behave the same way over and over, that manages expectations. But important for my purposes, after 1994, they started using public communication, specifically speeches, to better explain their assumptions and be more what they call transparent with the market about what it is they're doing underneath the hood. Their idea is that transparency should, quote unquote, help build confidence and stabilize the market. Again, now you're starting to see echoes of the COVID vaccine pledge and Mnuchin's assurance to the market. Ben Bernanke in his memoir said, increased transparency about our policy framework has aided public informing expectations and reduced uncertainty. So he actually claims that this has happened. what are some examples of what I mean by how simple these reassurances are? Here's a statement in one of the speeches by Greenspan. We at the Fed are given mandates that are not often spelled out explicitly. First, to implement effective monetary policy, and second, to do so in the most open and transparent manner in recognition that we are accountable to Congress and American people. Janet Yellen, when sworn in, said, the goals set by Congress are maximum employment, stable prices. I promise to do all that I can. So I remember, it sounds very similar to this COVID-19 pledge. Seems very harmless. Seems like they're reassuring things that we already know to be true. That's the problem. Here's how I go about this. If we understand that pointing to something, even though it's supportive, might rip that veneer off, how am I going to get at that? So I develop an event study where I sample all of the speeches from 1998 to 2014. I hand code all of the speeches paragraph by paragraph. Do they explicitly talk about these assumptions in a paragraph or not? If they do, I count the number of paragraphs that they expose these assumptions divided by total number of paragraphs in the speech, creates a measure of the degree to which any speech exposed these or tried to reaffirm these already taken for granted assumptions. If we want to measure the outcome, I'm using the premier outcome measure of market uncertainty, the VIX index. What I find simply is the more the Fed chairs talk about and reaffirm these assumptions, the more uncertainty in the market goes up. And of course, the emotional content underlying these speeches kind of helps investors make more sense. So if the speech was particularly positive, it kind of sugar-coated this effect. If there was already a lot of fear in the media, it exacerbated this effect. Now, a final interesting effect that I think is important to recognize is my effect is only contingent on the fact that these assumptions were taken for granted. Remember, with the COVID-19 vaccine example, if you already assumed that these pharmaceutical companies were cutting corners and you no longer took these things for granted, then this might have actually reduced uncertainty. Well, during the financial crisis, this was the moment in which the assumptions underlying the Federal Reserve were weakened, and people were starting to actually wonder, well, are they doing the right thing? And not only does the effect diminish during the financial crisis, but when you look at the speeches with the highest amount of positive tone during this most uncertain time where the veneer had already been ripped away, the effect reverses, which is essentially that, yes, this transparency helps, but only when people need to be told that this is a reassurance that's important. How do I think these ideas might advance the field? I think generally speaking, thinking about taken for grantedness as a powerful force that kind of perpetuates institutions, I think this paper really points to how fragile this otherwise assumed to be super powerful force legitimating our institutions really can be, and when that fragility comes to fruition. Methodologically, I think I offered a way to actually gain traction on how to measure and examine taken for grantedness. How do you study something that when you point to it, it disappears, right? Like as soon as you ask somebody about, do you take something for granted? They no longer take it for granted. So you can't ask them via survey or question. So how do you get at it? I think this is one way. And practically, I can talk about this later if you have questions, but I demonstrated this in a consequential empirical setting. It turns out, I think I got a little lucky that this setting was so kind of counterintuitive, because this is explicitly what economists and the Federal Reserve central bankers think isn't going on. And so, I didn't go in planning that it was counterintuitive. It just so happens that it was really the opposite of what people thought was going on. So that is all I have to share for now. Thank you so much. Look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. So moving on to the discussion session moderated by Mark David. So Mark David, if you're ready.
Coming up. So first of all, just before I launch into that, I do want to just give a thanks to the organizers that have pulled this all together. So please join me in thanking them all for the excellent work they've done. And thank you to the ASQ blog organizers. And just so you have their names, it's Ayunwi, Hui, Kevin, Melody, and Yusaku. Thank you for all you do for the journal and for building that community around it. This is a student-run activity. Just to clarify that, the entire ASQ blog is run by students. It relies on students, and they're an amazing team that actually support basically getting everything out there in terms of giving you a little bit of an insight and maybe challenging your taken for granted assumptions about the blog. So Derek has told us that's a bad thing. So the ASQ blog, you're awful according to Derek, but according to everybody else at ASQ, you're wonderful, or something like that. Maybe we're misinterpreting Derek's paper a little bit. Just to launch in, there's several questions that have come up. I did ask Yusaku if it's okay, just so we can have an idea of who's here today, if we could just do a really quick poll, just so we understand where you're at. And if Yusaku, if you could just launch that really quickly, it would be helpful.
Sure.
Great. So we've got the responses in there, just to share those all with you there. We have a good distribution of students there, about 80% of you, and then a variety at the various other levels. So welcome everybody. And thank you for joining us. So a few quick direct questions to Hila and Derek, if it's okay. And then there's several questions that have been coming up in the chat already that Ayunwi has promised to pull out the good ones and remember them all and be able to scan, because she reads much quicker than the older people in the room like me. So she's keeping good track of them, and she's going to jump in with some of those questions. But to start, I want to actually just first throw a question to Hila, if it's okay. And Hila, if you were to take the implications of your paper, what type of identity work should academics be involved in nowadays in our field to prepare for the future and maybe ensure that academia continues to be part of the innovation ecosystem broadly now that it's opening up and changing and transforming? So just curious what the insights from your paper might imply for what we as academics should do around identity work.
That's such a great question. I'm experiencing it myself, right? So I'm both thinking about my work and I also have been thinking about it personally. So based on what I've seen, and I'm seeing it also in other domains, as I said, in new studies of AI, there is an ability for some professionals, and it could be related to their cognitive flexibility. There are, some people asked about personality characteristic, but there is an ability for some professionals. What I found in the NASA study, for instance, it was professionals that moved between disciplines, between groups. So those that were not attached to just one way of doing things, those professionals have the ability to zoom out of the how of their work and to think about the bigger why. So I would say the same thing for us as professors, as academics, as researchers. If we will be able to now forget for a second, zoom out, let go for a second of the how, the fact that we were used to teach in a physical classroom, but to think about those bigger whys. Why did we came to this profession? What gives us satisfactions? Why are we doing this? Then they had a way to reconstruct their identity and to find new ways of doing the work and capability and gain new capabilities that they did not have before. Indeed, some capabilities were destructed, but some new ones got gained. So I would say it's that ability to zoom out from the how and to focus on the why, because we get over attached to how we do our work, and that becomes our identity over the years, right? We think this is what it means to be a professor, to go into a classroom. So I expressed it and felt it myself in the summer as I was thinking about moving into remote. I had days that I would talk to my friend and say, but this is who I am. I need to stand up and see my students and interact in class. And then I said, is it, am I able to think about it differently? Like, why am I teaching? It's about learning. Learning maybe can happen in different ways that I haven't thought about. Let's try to rediscover them. So that's what I think is happening right now.
So to push you on that just a little bit, if it's okay. So why do academics do research?
It's a big question. So I don't think there's a one answer for all. I think it's there are few. So I wouldn't say it's completely personal, it's meant, but I assume there are few. For some, it's the intellectual challenge. For others, it is just a career, I would say, an interesting one. But for those that it is about the intellectual challenge, then I think that doing research in different ways actually amplifies the challenge, because you're challenged not only on the topic, but both on the process of how you're doing it. But it is very hard. It's the same thing with the scientists that I've studied. Like, this is how we've been mentored, right? To work mostly alone or with few only others. And there are scientists, social scientists, computer scientists now working in an open way. Michael Bernstein at Stanford, he writes paper. He has once a week a meeting online with anyone who wants to join to his project. And he has been co-authoring actually with people that are not PhD students, people that you've never met, that are from the crowd and have collaborated with him on his projects. So I'm seeing it in computer science, in astronomy, not yet in social sciences, but I think things are changing.
Okay, and just so that Derek doesn't feel left out there, I feel badly if you do, Derek. So I want to throw over a question to you as well, if it's okay. Derek, based on your findings as well, what take it for granted assumptions about our field do we never discuss, but we should? And what would happen if we actually discussed them?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I might think certain things are taken for granted and these conversations are being had. So that might be going on. One thing I should say as a caveat is, the implied in your question, I think, is like a normative assumption that we should be changing something. Like if we should be talking about assumptions, that implies we normatively should expect change. Whereas, my paper is kind of the opposite, where it's almost as if we want stability and we accidentally get change. So I think that's an important caveat. But if I was to say, there's many things that I think are tricky about whether we should want change normatively or not. But one thing I'll push on, ironically, is the replication crisis conversation, which I think is oddly enough, it's more complicated than I think people talk about. So the people that talk about replication crisis, p-hacking, all of this stuff, they're exposing assumptions and creating a lot of uncertainty, especially for a lot of junior folks, about whether we're teched up enough, trained enough, like, am I doing something right, wrong? It's very scary for people. But I actually don't think we should stop there. My point or answer to Mark David would be, we need to go deeper down the rabbit hole and expose their assumptions. And what I mean by that is, there's motivation for people to p-hack, there's motivation for people to not replicate. And people are building careers on finding non-replication. And so why aren't we talking about the equivalent motivations to not replicate? It's much easier not to replicate something than to replicate it, by the way. So why aren't we not talking about this? Also, it seems like, why are we assuming that everything should replicate? I think we should be talking about more explicitly when replication should be expected, in which fields, which methods, which data, right? I feel like we're just putting a veneer on all of this stuff and letting this replication conversation go on its own and scare the crap out of people. I think we should open it up even further. And I think short term, it's going to create more uncertainty, like my paper would suggest. But I think long term, the good thing is that it would improve our understanding about how knowledge aggregates differently with different types of knowledge, different types of questions, different types of data. There's a recent, I think, AER paper about how different fields replicate differently, but also different methods replicate differently. Like, the assumptions underlying whether we should expect variation isn't even a question. We just look at economics and say they replicate, and look at social psychology and say they don't. And we say social psychologists are full of malfeasance and making up data. That's just not true. So I think a deeper conversation about the assumptions underlying the replication crisis would go a long way for me.
Okay, and just to come back, thank you, Derek. Hila, just want to ask you a question that came out from the chat as well, if it's okay. One of the questions that popped up immediately as you were jumping in to discussing your research context was, how did you secure access to NASA? And if you can disclose that without having us to keep a secret for you, please do let us know.
Of course. So there is actually, it's not a secret, it's executive education. That's the answer. So I would say, and I have a friend that after what I've done, she also came to executive education. I told her, listen, like, you know, it's like a different building, but there are managers coming here. Like, we should just like get to talk to them somehow. And she has her dissertation as well in a different way with surveys and stuff. So I would say executive education is an unleveraged access bridge, because it is hard to get access. And it's not that it was easy. So to make sure that it doesn't sound that I just talked to someone and lo and behold, I was internally and inside, of course, I had to go through double IRB, both from them. But the hard part was that I wasn't sure it's a good fit. So I would say with field research, it's not clear immediately when you start if it's the right field process. So what I usually talk to my students is I try to talk about kind of a little bit like dating or something, that you have to explore multiple options simultaneously or not. That's a different thing. I actually prefer simultaneously, at least for a while, for my students to try to talk to multiple field sites and to try to get access, because it's very hard a priori to know whether this is going to be the right design for you. So we have different ways of thinking about it. Some of my colleagues talk about out of every 6 field sites that you encounter, maybe 1 will become a dissertation site. I would say that what most of my students have at least tried 3. And I myself have been, as I was in the same time, talking to General Mills, to GE, to IBM, to Starbucks at the time. All of these organizations were using new ways of innovating. Most of them were online open innovation platforms, but they do not all succeed. But you have to take it into account if you want to do field research. It's not that the first one you'll hit will go.
Okay, and in follow-up to that, to Derek, a related question that came out of the chat there was, you've invested a lot of time and energy into doing this data, and one of the questions that came from chat was, what would happen if you found absolutely nothing at all? And how would you deal with that, or what do you recommend around that? What are your thoughts around that, after investing the data time up front for the prospect of just finding absolutely nothing?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. Number one, you can approach complex research design with backdoors or trap doors that basically are last resorts that are not as interesting perhaps, but you build in, you collect an extra variable, or you build in an extra portion of an experimental design where you have backups. So that's one thing that I had, where there's other linguistic things I could study ex post that maybe wouldn't be as interesting and maybe wouldn't have been as theoretically derived, but they were there. Another way to do it is to build in, competing hypotheses, or at least a competing understanding of how theories could support both sides hypothetically. And so then just finding a null is the risk. It's not only finding one direction. So that can be useful as well. I will just say, and this is anecdotally for me, I approached this particular paper so theoretically driven. I actually came up with the hypothesis and sought a context in which to test it. I was and I've never been this confident about a hypothesis before being true, that I just believed that, it was a matter of just getting the right measurement, because I believed that this effect existed somewhere. And hopefully here, and I needed to measure things appropriately to capture it. I haven't been as confident about all my predictions, but I think my level of confidence in the underlying theory drove my excitement to kind of overlook the risk. I'm not sure if I would recommend that, but that's how it worked out here.
So Derek, just following up on that, what made you so, shall we say, take your confidence for granted, or take your ideas for granted?
So the way I went about this paper is kind of ultimately telling. So I wrote co-authored a theory paper in AMR in 2015 that basically predicted via propositions, not hypotheses, that the more you talk about the rules of the game, as opposed to talking within the rules of the game and leaving the assumptions implicit, the more that would create instability. And so and anecdotally, I see this all the time. Like, you can just look at the news and see it happens. And so I think for me, I was like, well, this is a true effect. I actually ran an experiment that showed this effect very, very strongly. I couldn't get it to go away. And so in every experiment that I ran, it replicated. But if you were to imagine this exact same theory, but running an experiment, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. So I think I was on the hunt for an archival setting that would demonstrate the power of it, not just the theory of it. So I think all of that baggage carried into the context of the Fed made me very confident that I was excited to plausibly find something.
And does talking about it confidently now make you challenge your assumptions or not?
Yeah, I certainly don't think that this is the way it always works. I've never felt that level of confidence again in any other paper, to be completely honest. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Hila, a question for you, actually, and actually this question I'm going to throw out to both of you, if it's okay, but we'll start with Hila. One of the hallmarks of ASQ papers is that we tend to think very long-term about the impact of them. We don't focus on short-term impact at all. It's actually not something we even consider when looking at papers. So, one heuristic that we sometimes use is when this paper is then read many, many years later. So for instance, let's say that your paper is assigned on a doctoral syllabus 25 years from now in a doctoral seminar. What do you hope those doctoral students are going to do for their quick summary of your paper, as this is the major contribution that Hila made with this paper? And Derek, I'll ask you the same question right after Hila responds to it.
Not fair that Derek has more time to think about it. It's a really good question. So in 25 years, what will students take of it? So I really think that as human beings, our ability to rethink ourselves is not as changing as fast as technology is. So even in my newer study on hackathons and 3D printing, I saw that technology can run really fast, but people and their processes not necessarily. So in that sense, I hope that still in 25 years, there will be an insight that is still valid around new technologies. I think that technology can change in that sense. Like here it was online platforms, now it could be AI, it was 3D printing. But the fact that in order to go through a change that deeply changes the way you work, you have to go through this identity refocusing, and it takes time and it's challenging and there will be fragmentations, but not only rejection, which was the literature was in this very stark, mode so far. And it'd say, oh, it will only reject, we only want power, and like, why would we even change? So I think the fact that we can go through change and how these professionals went through the change will give some insights still in the future with the new technologies that we'll have, and what is the nature of that change and this identity refocusing work. I hope to believe that insight and that connection between the how, the doing, and the being of who we are will still remain true.
Okay, and Derek, if we step over to you with the same question. Sorry, Hila, on the next question, I'm going to ask Derek first so you have a little more time. Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to go first. So I think like at a surface level, the key finding that people would cite it for ceremonially would be something along the lines of, reaffirming assumptions disrupts, or the fragility of taken for grantedness. Like that's like the one-off citation pattern. But I think personally, I'm going to be idealistic. Personally, what I would like to be recognized for in 25 years is really reopening the conversation and trying to explicitly study taken for grantedness, like as an object of study. I think in my opinion, it is the most interesting, both theoretically, practically, component of an institution, of categories, of routines, of practices. Like this taken for grantedness is by far the most interesting and also powerful element of these processes. Yet there's been very little explicit work on it. I mean, so it's all indirect. We kind of like back into, oh, that must have been taken for granted because nobody said anything about it. There was silence. There's a fly, sorry. And so, but does silence?
I feel like I'm watching a vice presidential debate.
Yeah, I know,
now,
right?
Just saying, but okay.
That's right. Like, but does silence mean they took it for granted? Of course not. They could be forced to not speak. They could be normatively feeling like they shouldn't speak up. We're in a world right now where we're silent a lot of the times, but we're not cognitively silent, right? So I really want this paper to try to open up the explicit study of taken for grantedness and cognitive legitimacy more directly.
Okay, and sorry, Yinmi, I saw the chat comment there. Yeah, it's too soon. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm coming from across the border. My apologies. Yes, from the north, the great north here. Derek, so just for fairness sake, I'm going to give you the next question, and then Hila, I'm going to give this question to you as well. You have a little more time to think about it. So Derek, if you're, and this is appropriate from the chat that Yinmi just put there as well. If you look at the challenges facing the world currently, and thinking about your paper, what new research questions do you actually see that we as a field need to answer to help address those societal challenges? So in essence, perhaps even topics that might be good for dissertations, like that level of question, or for major research projects.
Yeah. So I don't know how to get in. I don't know how to answer these questions or even ask the right questions. But what I've been thinking a lot about on how to apply these ideas is this kind of balance between our pushes for transparency and privacy in today's world, and more specifically, our trust in institutions. So for example, we elect representatives and trust certain institutions to conduct activities on our behalf. So we defer to them and take certain things for granted. We assume medical professionals know how best to treat us. We assume that the FDA knows how best to approve treatments. We assume that the police know how best to protect us. And I think my point of saying this is, at least today and in the next decade, we've seen in the last just condensed 6 months that when we rip back the veneer of all of these things, I think we're a little shocked to realize that what we thought was going on, it wasn't going on, right? So, but it raises a lot of questions. The institutions that we once trusted and take for granted are now open for question, but what are the solutions? Should everyone have access to everything? Should we have access to every police officer's body cam footage? Should we have access to their entire disciplinary record? Like, these are not easy questions. And so diving into like, who should have access to these things? Who should we trust to have access? And really this question of power, is the biggest confusion to me, right? Like we know that things need to change, but who has the right to kind of implement these changes, and what's the most effective way of doing these things? I don't have any good answers or questions to get at this, but I think this big idea of power and transparent access is the next 10 years in my mind.
Okay, so broadly, like a broad topic area in essence, and then the individual questions need to be developed at this point still from your perspective.
Yeah, it gets back to the idea of hegemony of powerful institutions. And we're now in a more democratized society with Twitter, social media. It's like we're ripping the veneer back over and over, but like, where is this going to settle out? I don't know what's best normatively. I think that's an open question.
Okay, it sounds like a big major project to take on. Hila, what are your thoughts on it?
So I have 3 thoughts kind of related, since I had a few minutes to think. So the first one is studying the work itself. I feel we are in a management, business schools, and we're supposed to be looking at professionals, and we hardly actually study the work processes themselves. So I personally love innovation work processes, but there are many others. So I would say dare to study something that maybe is not as clear or as and clearly understood by others, but this is what people actually do. And we've gone away from it. So I would say bring the work back and look at what is changing already now. So there is this notion of the future of work. And I would say it's currently, like, work is changing now. So like the future is already here. It's just, not distributed evenly, as William Gibson says. So I would say look for where it's already changing. And COVID is providing, fortunately or unfortunately for many, change in work already. So there are many opportunities, I would say, for students to see now how work is changing. The second thing that is related is the role of technology. So as someone who studies technology, work, organizations, professionals, I feel we are drinking the technology Kool-Aid too much, too often. So we need to remember that technology is amoral, it doesn't need to lead us. We are the humans, we have the agency. We could develop it the way we think is right. So now I'm happy to see that there's starting to be more like, AI and ethics, AI and morality, but there are many issues where we should be leading the stand. So also in the study that I've just shared, it doesn't mean that always you need to embrace open online platforms for everything, but we need to have a better sense of when should we do what, which technology helps what, to which people. Some people have capabilities that are better like that, or others. And today managers are really taking just efficiency measurements. And I'm seeing it with AI today, and I start, with the Open Innovation Platform. So in some cases, the professionals are strong enough to resist, but in many others, AI in sales, in marketing, in finance, in accounting, professionals are just, kind of surrendering, I would almost say, and managers are kind of just looking at efficiency, and that's the way to go. So if technology is more efficient, and efficiency covers a lot of things. So even though if it looks fast and cheaper, it doesn't mean it's better for us in a society. So I think that's the second thing. And the last thing is to intervene. I got it as a comment once when I was presenting with many others. I invited someone, kind of a celebrity scholar, I would say, from human-computer interactions. You said, all of you social scientists are like analyzing corpse. You're like waiting for something to happen, and then you're looking at it. Why not do something about it if you have insight, if you have hypotheses, if you know what's right? So I've been trying ever since to not only do field studies, but also field experiments. They are more complicated as a method, but I warmly recommend for new PhD students to think about field experiments, since we have developed theories that are worth intervening, trying, learning more through experimenting. So I would say that's if I could recommend, that would be something that I recommend for PhD students.
So there's a remarkable, or at least I see a remarkable amount of consistency across your responses. And I hope it's given some inspiration to some of the students who are at the stage of trying to figure out what they might be working on. I'm recognizing the time right now, and I know Ayinwi is collecting questions, and we do have breakouts coming. But right before we jump into that, I just want to first take a moment to congratulate both Derek and Hila on the award as well. So this is for you, and just a big applause to it. Congratulations on the Dissertation Award from ASQ. For those of you that are not aware of it, the Dissertation Award is basically given once a year by a committee that's designated. It's not chosen by the editors. There's actually an external committee that's set up to go through all of the dissertation-based papers in a given year. And that's actually quite a high number. So if you do have a dissertation paper that you're thinking of sending somewhere, please do send it to ASQ so that in future years, the future ASQ blog people will be able to invite you to one of these sessions to basically speak about your wonderful dissertation paper as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Ayinwi and Yusaku to figure out exactly how we're doing the breakout rooms. Thank you all.
Yep. Well, thank you very much for the three distinguished guests today. So we have, I created 2 breakout rooms for each of the speakers, Hila and Derek. And so you guys, the participants, can choose which one to join. You should be able to see it now.
Did you want to, just really quickly, we'll lay out the questions that came through the chat, because some were for both Hila as well as Derek, and then you can continue the discussion in the breakout rooms. So just really quickly, as folks are picking from their rooms, we touched on a few of them, but one, I think Vikas asked about how it is that you found the right topic that you ended up finally working on. Was it a conscious choice, or was it something that happened more by accident? And then if there were any criteria that you used in deciding what your dissertation topic was going to be. Next, I think you touched on this a little bit, but it'll probably generate additional conversation in the breakouts, which was, how is it you handle uncertainty and concern? And you can kind of go into further depth there. And then how many years was it that you actually ended up spending? So I think that is working on your thesis and your dissertation. I believe Derek was able to answer in the chat already about, thinking about the matches between methods and theories and context. But also I feel as though there was a question associated with the findings and whether or not there was some relevance to personality and characteristics. I think those were the last ones and the general ones. And then for Hila, your last one was, given your incredibly rich qualitative data set, how on earth did you handle all of that data? Any tips on managing analysis of qualitative data? Okay. And with that, just another reminder that you can go and join your breakout rooms at this point.
I'm going to stop the recording at this point because I think we can do that. Yeah.
Good idea.
There's nothing to see here.